The mountain had a voice, and only Tarak knew how to listen. It spoke in the deep, percussive groan of a glacier calving in the high valleys, a sound that resonated in his massive chest. It whispered in the hiss of wind, scouring snow from a barren ridge, and it roared in the thunder of an avalanche, a force that could peel the world down to its bare stone bones. For Tarak, these were not random noises. They were the language of his ancestor, the great, sleeping spirit whose spine formed the jagged peaks and whose breath was the thin, biting air. He was the last of its true children, a guardian of its sacred silences. His body was a map of this land. A broad, flaring ribcage housed lungs that could drink deeply of the oxygen-starved air. A gift from 1,000 generations who had called this unforgiving altitude home. His blood ran thick and warm, a furnace against the relentless cold. He was a Denisovan, a being of immense strength and solitude, perfectly and profoundly adapted to a world that would kill a lesser creature in a single night. And lesser creatures had arrived. He called them the ghosts. He would see them sometimes, impossibly far below, their slender forms moving like water weeds in the wind. They were a new kind of human, all sharp angles and quick, nervous movements. They clung to the lowest valleys, the life bleeders, where the air was thick and the trees grew in huddled masses. They were intruders in his sacred space, their fires a rash of flickering insults against the profound, starry darkness of the mountain's night. He watched them with a detached, ancient disdain. They were fragile. They were temporary. The mountain would endure them as it endured the summer melt, and then the long cold would come and scour them away. His own life was a ritual, unchanging and deliberate. He moved between 3 main caves, following the seasonal migrations of the ibex and the wild sheep. His primary home, the one his father's father had expanded, was a deep cavern high on the mountain's flank, its walls holding the faint, faded ochre outlines of long-vanished megafauna and the handprints of his ancestors. He would trace their powerful, wide fingers with his own, feeling the continuity of his bloodline, a silent conversation across the ages. He was a living memory, the final repository of their stories, their hunts, and their spirit. He was alone, but he was not lonely. The mountain was his clan. One cycle of the moon, curiosity, a rare and dangerous impulse, drew him down from his heights. He followed the faint trail of the ghosts to an abandoned seasonal camp nestled in a river valley. The place felt wrong, cluttered with the detritus of their lives. He surveyed it with the critical eye of a master survivor. Their hearth was small. The wood burned with a careful efficiency, unlike his own roaring fires. He saw piles of tiny, sharp flint flakes, the byproduct of making tools with a delicacy that baffled him. Then he found it, lying half buried in the dirt near the fire pit. It was a needle, carved from the bone of a bird, no thicker than a pine needle. At its end was a perfectly drilled, impossibly small eye. He picked it up, his thick fingers fumbling with its alien grace. He compared it to his own toolkit, a heavy, robust awl of sharpened mammoth ivory, designed to punch holes through thick, stiff hides. This needle was for sewing, for joining pieces of fur with a fineness that spoke of fitted clothing, of a life that had time for such frivolous detail. He held the needle in his palm and laughed, a low, rumbling sound. He imagined one of the slender ghosts trying to survive a true mountain storm, their frail bodies wrapped in their neatly stitched skins. They were playing at life in the shadow of a god. He tossed the needle aside, his belief in their weakness now cemented into fact. They did not have the strength. They did not know how to listen. The mountain seemed to agree. As the season turned, its voice grew agitated. The winds came earlier and with a new, serrated edge. The first snows were not a gentle dusting, but a heavy, wet blanket that smothered the landscape. The groans of the ice were deeper, more frequent. Tarak felt a grim satisfaction. The mountain was stirring, preparing to cleanse itself. He retreated to his highest cave, the one of his ancestors, and sealed the entrance with a heavy curtain of bearskin. He had stores of dried meat, racks of marrow bones, and the deep, abiding strength of his lineage. He was ready. The storm that came was not a storm. It was a change in the state of the world. It was a solid, living thing, a white roar that erased the concepts of day and night. The wind did not howl. It was a constant physical pressure that made the very stones of the cave hum. Tarak had weathered countless blizzards, but this was different. This was the mountain speaking in a voice of pure, untempered rage. For days, he did not stir. He husbanded his strength, eating sparingly, his mind a calm lake of ancestral memory. But the storm did not break. A week passed, then another. The world outside his bearskin curtain remained a vortex of white fury. His supply of dried meat began to shrink. He cracked the marrow bones one by one, sucking out the precious, fatty life within, his mind meticulously counting how many remained. The cold, for the first time in his life, became his enemy. It was no longer an environment to which he was adapted. It was a predator, constantly probing the seams of his furs, leaching the heat from his bones. His magnificent Denisovan furnace, which had burned hot for 50 winters, was beginning to run low on fuel. And the silence, once his companion, became a torment. The roar of the storm was a constant, but it was a mindless noise. It had no cadence, no meaning. The true voice of the mountain, the subtle language he had spent his life learning, was gone, drowned out by the blizzard's fury. He was truly alone, adrift in a sea of white noise. His solitude, once his pride, was now a crushing heavy stone in his chest. He began to talk to the fading ochre paintings on the wall, his voice sounding thin and alien in the confines of the cave. He told them of his hunts. He spoke the names of his ancestors. He described the fragile ghosts in the valley. He was trying to fill the terrible emptiness, to keep the legacy alive with the sound of his own voice. He knew, with a certainty that was as cold as the stone beneath him, how this would end. He would consume the last of his marrow, and then he would sit with his back to the ancestral wall, and the cold would finally claim him. It was a good death, a strong death, the last of the mountain's true sons rejoining its stone heart. He had performed his duty. He had listened until the very end. Near the end, when delirium began to weave its strange tapestries in his mind, he heard a new sound. It was a rhythmic, scraping noise, sharp and purposeful, somehow cutting through the monolithic roar of the wind. Scrape, scrape, pause, scrape. He dismissed it. It was the ice. It was the wind tearing at a loose rock. It was the sound of his own blood pounding in his ears, a final fading drumbeat. It was a ghost of a sound, but it grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the wall of snow and ice that had sealed his cave entrance for what felt like a lifetime. Suddenly, with a dull thump, a section of the snowdrift collapsed inward. Light, so painfully bright and pure it felt like a physical blow, flooded the cave. Tarak threw a hand over his eyes, a low growl rumbling in his throat. A figure stood silhouetted in the opening. It was one of them, a ghost. Primal instinct, the last burning ember of his strength, flared to life. He would not die cowering in the dark. He would die on his feet, defending this sacred space from an intruder. He roared, a sound of pure ancestral defiance, and pushed himself up. The world swam in a dizzying vortex of white light and black shadows. His legs, weak from hunger, trembled and gave out. He collapsed onto the floor of the cave, his great strength utterly spent. The figure rushed forward. Tarak braced for a spear thrust, for a stone axe, for the sharp, brutal end he had given to so many beasts, but none came. The figure knelt beside him, its movements swift and certain. It was a woman, her face framed by a hood of pale fox fur, her dark, intelligent eyes wide with an emotion he could not place. It wasn't the fear or aggression he expected. It was Something else. Something softer. Concern. She was joined by two others. They moved with a quiet, startling efficiency, their slender bodies seemingly untroubled by the thin air that should have left them gasping. They built a fire with practiced ease, their movements economical and sure. The woman held a small skin to his lips, and he tasted warm, salty broth, a shock of life that was almost painful. He watched them, his mind a swirl of confusion. They moved as if they belonged here. The woman noticed his gaze. She pulled down the fur covering her own throat and pointed to her chest, which rose and fell with a slow, easy rhythm. Then she held out her hand. Lying in her palm was a pendant on a leather thong. It was a piece of polished greenish stone, veined with white quartz. It was the stone of this mountain, the sacred bedrock of Tarak's own cave. She pointed from the pendant to Tarak, then back to her own chest, her expression one of profound reverence. And then another, a man, pulled back his own hood, and in the broadness of his jaw, the slight heaviness of his brow, and the sheer power in his deep-set eyes, Tarak saw it. It was a ghost of a reflection, a faint but unmistakable echo of his own people, of himself. The shocking, world-shattering truth landed on him not like a rock slide, but like the gentle melting of a glacier, revealing the landscape that had been hidden beneath. They hadn't tracked him to conquer him. They had sought him out. They had followed the signs of his existence, not as a threat, but as a legend. They were not fragile intruders. Their blood was laced with the same ancient strength as his own. The gift for breathing the thin air, the legacy of his ancestors, had not died out. It had been given away, a mingling of bloodlines in a time before memory. The mountain had a voice, and he had been hearing only one part of the story, the lonely echo of his own solitude. These people, these clever, resilient ghosts, were hearing it too. They were the mountain's children, same as him. His blood ran in their veins. He was not the last guardian. He was the elder they had been searching for. He looked at the faces around him, strangers who carried his own hidden past within them. The mountain had not fallen silent. It had just learned a new language. His long winter was over.